Paul Manship represents something of a conundrum to our classic account of the Roaring Twenties. Think of that decade and all the hallmarks of modernity seem to spring to mind: skyscrapers, automobiles, flappers, jazz, and airplanes. And yet in Paul Manship we have an extremely successful and popular sculptor whose work seems to look distinctly backwards. Gods and goddesses, heroes, and the fantastic creatures of Greek and Roman mythology were his primary subjects throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century. In fact, for Manship's contemporaries, it was precisely this bridge between his love of classical traditions and academic styles, with a modern sensibility, that earned him praise and accolades. His 1925 Diana is often seen as the culmination of these two seemingly disparate elements, archaism on the one hand, and modernity on the other. The Roman goddess of the hunt is seen here in flight from Actaeon, the male hunter who stumbled upon the virgin goddess while she was bathing. To punish him for seeing what no mortal male should see, she turned him into a stag, whereupon he was chased down by his own hunting dogs and killed. Manship did create an Actaeon as a companion piece to Diana, but it was Diana that earned all the attention both then and now. It has always been difficult to sympathize with this unfortunate victim, wrote one critic of Manship's Actaeon sculpture, and then continued, Manship's sympathy is also with Diana. Indeed, it is hard to take our eyes off the graceful form of Diana in flight. Described as the supreme example of the fluidity of line, the figure runs, leaps, turns, and fires an arrow all at once, truly a goddess-like feat. Modern scholars have seen Diana as one of the most legitimate and potent alternatives to the abstracted, non-representational forms of modernism. In fact, much of Manship's success can be seen as rooted in what it wasn't. It wasn't the European avant-garde that Americans were just beginning to discover during Manship's rise to fame, particularly in New York City. But I think it would be reductive to say that Diana and Manship's other works were popular simply because they weren't Rodin or Picasso. Diana, in the context of the 1920s, does speak to that era, even through its archaic subject matter. Consider the speed with which Diana moves. Her feet have left the earth, as have her hounds, both bounding in a moment of effortless momentum. Surely it is hard to think of another era more profoundly interested in speed than the 1920s. Speed became one of the defining characteristics of modernity. Of course, the pleasure of speed also comes from the pleasure of open space in which to run and leap or sprint as Diana seems to do. Remember that the 1920 census marked the first time that urban Americans outnumbered rural Americans. Born a Minnesotan, Manship had reached into the mythology of the American frontier in works prior to Diana, as well as the mythology of ancient Rome. This goddess of the hunt was also associated with all living creatures, and Manship was a true lover of animals. When we consider an early sketch of Diana's hound, for example, we see how Manship took a consciously different approach to the goddess's companion. Instead of depicting ferocity, Manship chose to depict a dog's sheer love of running free. Manship made a conscious move to celebrate Diana and the hound's freedom, and the love of movement, of speed, and the joy of bounding through a natural landscape. Diana was displayed in 1925, the same year Aldo Leopold suggested that many of the attributes most distinctive of America and Americans are the result of the impress of wilderness and the life that accompanied it. Thus, this 2,000-year-old archaic goddess of the past was made by Manship to speak to the impulses of the 1920s and questions about what was modern and what was American. But Manship himself was ambivalent about these very questions. To our eyes, Diana appears quintessentially Art Deco, a term that would be applied retroactively to much of the decorative arts in the 1920s and 30s. But Manship was not entirely comfortable with many of the manifestations of Art Deco we associate with the artistic movement today. He found mechanization and mass production deplorable, and never gave up the ornamental features of his work that would become subsumed in the 1930s under streamlined deco. Thus Diana represents yet another crossroads, not only between past and present in 1925, but also between 1925 and the future. Abstract modernism on the one side and streamlined machine-style Art Deco on the other would eventually overtake Manship and bring his popularity to an end. Diana represents a pinnacle then, when Manship, like his goddess, seemed to be unstoppable.